I, as Hannah said, have been working for Nutrien or its predecessor companies for over 30 years in agriculture. My background, I started actually working in an agricultural research position with a company that was called Imperial Oil, Esso. You all might be quite familiar. And over the last 30 years in my career, I have seen our company grow and acquire and merge with a lot of different companies to the point where in 2018, for those of you that follow the markets and business, you might have heard of a merger between Potash Corp of Saskatchewan and Agrium. And that resulted in a company today that is called Nutrien. And that's the company that I now work with. But to give you a sense, there's been a lot of merger and acquisition and consolidation in the agricultural space. And I've been really fortunate as a result of that to always work for a growing agricultural company with a real eye to the future. My current role with the company is as the global lead for our agricultural and environmental sustainability initiatives. But my experience has been quite far-reaching. I started in field research, testing fertilizer products and application methods in the field back in 1990 when I left university, and felt very fortunate to have that role in field research. It gave me the opportunity to work directly with farmers, trying out new products, and from that I advanced into a role where my job was called an extension role, where I spent a lot of time taking that research and turning it into presentations at the farm level, talking to farmers about what were the new and upcoming technologies and application methods. And so that was where I first cut my teeth in having to do public speaking. My next role in the company really turned into more of a regulatory role. So I took what I knew about agricultural practices and started talking to the regulators, particularly at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, around fertilizer regulation. And so learned a little bit about policy development. From there, my next job was in sales and marketing. So having had a really strong technical background for about 15 years in agricultural research and policy, I then felt the need to really understand the kind of return on investment in our business. How do we make money? How do farmers make money? What costs us money? And that's a really important concept when you're looking at environmental impacts and the cost of correcting some of those problems. You really need to understand the size of the problem opposite your business's economic performance. So that marketing and distribution role was an interesting one for me, but as a technical agronomist, I was a bit of a square peg in a round hole. So about 5 years ago, I got the opportunity to move into the sustainability and stakeholder relations group in our company. And within that group, my responsibility has shifted back more to technical agricultural knowledge and working with external stakeholders. So by external stakeholders, I mean a lot of the environmental non-governmental organizations that are looking at agriculture and improving agriculture. I work with industry association groups, trade groups, universities, academics, and policy. All of those folks, as well as consumers, are what we call external stakeholders for agriculture. So that's a little bit of background about myself and how I'm in my current role and whom I'm working with. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Nutrien. Nutrien is a recent merger between Agrium and Potash Corp of Saskatchewan. We are based in Calgary. Our headquarters, our registered headquarters would be Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and we're a global operation. So what you can see here is that we have 27 fertilizer production facilities. Those facilities are located around the world. And we also operate over 1,800 distribution points, 2,000 retail locations worldwide, and we manufacture over 20 million tons of fertilizer. We make approximately 7 million tons of ammonia, 3 million tons of phosphate, and 20 million tons of potash. So in total, close to 30 million tons of fertilizer manufacture. We're not just a fertilizer manufacturer, we're a full integrated agricultural supply company. So in addition to fertilizer manufacture, we also provide farmers with seed products, crop protection products, agronomic services, which a lot of that is digital agronomic services like precision farming platforms, data services, and agronomic advice. We employ professional agronomists, certified crop advisors, crop production advisors. All of these people work directly with farmers in the field to advise them on farm management practices. So that's a little bit about who we are as a company. I think it can be a little bit dull if I just talk for the next 45 minutes, and I know we have some Q&A at the end of this session, but at any point in time, if there's questions in the chat that I can't see, and if you want to interrupt me with a question, you can place it in the chat, or someone can, go ahead and just ask me a question directly. I'm not quite sure. I'm not managing the whole thing, but I'm happy to take questions in the presentation as we go along, if that works for anybody. So I thought what I'd start with is a little bit of a scene set on thinking about agriculture, because for everyone that's on the call, I'm not really sure what your relationship has been to agriculture or how you think about agriculture, but I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview of some ways of thinking about the different types of agriculture. Agriculture is not just one thing. So I've got some ideas on the screen here to talk about agriculture from a low impact or conservation perspective, and I'm representing that with animal management on grazing lands. And some people's approach to agriculture is really a low impact conservation mindset in agriculture. How do they preserve the wildlife habitat while they're managing, for example, their cattle herds? Other mindsets, philosophies in agricultural management are really focused on productivity. And I've represented that in the center of the screen with a really large commercial kind of farming operation where the real focus of that farm might be looking at the economic return on investment and really managing for optimum efficiency. Some farms are more focused on experimental new crops, and I'm representing that with actually a couple of researchers that we have in the field that look at developing new crop varieties. And I think about a lot of the farms that are really interested in expanding the diversity of crops that they grow on their field. That could be sorghum or millet or quinoa, but not your traditional crops. So really adding to the diversity of crop mix grown on the fields. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, what I've represented there is my personal kind of view around how I think about agriculture, which is I think about how can we manage agriculture, use technology, and get the most out of our most productive acres on the farm so that we can protect those acres that need to be in habitat left as wetlands for animals or as grassed areas around wetlands to protect those wetlands. All of that is enabled by having that ability to get the most out of the most productive acres that exist on the farm so we can protect those acres that are not well suited for agriculture. So just a little bit of a scene set on how I think about agriculture. And today in my presentation, what I really want to focus on is some of the global trends in sustainable agriculture and what are the driving forces behind those trends, what's the local context of those trends, and then in a few cases, I want to give some examples of some projects that Nutrien is undertaking in some of those areas. So I would say that the number one trend in agriculture today is the idea of agricultural transformation. There's many organizations looking at the challenge of feeding a growing world population and at the same time addressing the need to restore and protect the soil, water, and climate, all of those resources that are needed to produce food. Agricultural transformation means making a fundamental change in how land and water resources are used. And one organization that has come together as kind of a think tank in agricultural transformation is the Food and Land Use Coalition. So this coalition of a multi-stakeholder coalition, they've produced 10 critical transitions for agriculture that they've identified. And if you're interested, it's a report that I've referenced here on the bottom of the slide. I think it's one that you should look up if this is an area of strong interest for you. These transitions are really happening as a result of the shaping forces that are driving this urgency of transformation. So what we're seeing in shaping forces for agricultural transformation are demographic changes. There's really becoming a growing level of middle incomes globally, and that kind of rise in income level is driving a change in the demand for the type of food that people are able to access. I think I shifted slides accidentally. Sorry about that. The other kind of shaping forces that we have to be concerned with are slowing productivity gains. And by that, I mean that there's been a slowing rate in crop yield productivity gains over the last, let's say 20 years approximately. So while we've made some great advances with crop breeding and genetics, there has been a slowing rate of that increasing yield that we've been able to achieve. And so that's one of those shaping forces that we're all aware of. Another of the shaping forces is the limited amount of land that's suitable for agriculture. And there's increased competition for water resources. So that water scarcity is a real concern that is shaping this need for agricultural transformation. And then being concerned about climate change and what's happening in that space as people are seeing the impacts of climate change and how is that affecting agriculture. I just want to pause here for a minute and give you a perspective on how I talk about climate change in the agricultural community and how that's really being seen and translated. So I would say as recently as maybe 5 years ago, the climate change discussion at the farm level was pretty reserved and people weren't necessarily considering that climate change was something that they believed to be a real impact or something that they could understand and see occurring. So there was questions about, do they really have to be concerned about climate change? Is this something that's really happening? And what's really interesting about farmers is when you give them a question and a challenge, they think deeply about this. And what we've seen recently in the farm dialogue around climate change is the way that it occurs on the farms is they're seeing planting dates in the spring for corn crops in the central US, having moved from what may have been in previous years planting that occurred in May. Now that planting date is moving to April. And part of the reason for that could be related to improved crop genetics, but a lot of the reason for that is just a earlier warming in the spring and an earlier start date for good crop growth. So when farms start thinking about the fact that they are able to plant earlier, that they're seeing a change in the intensity of weather events, then that causes them to think that there is something happening in the climate that is causing these changes to occur. So I think it's interesting to think about climate change in relation to agriculture and how people on the farm are experiencing and understanding those changes in their own production systems. And now you're seeing a lot of discussion around climate change in agriculture and what farms can do to contribute to increasing the resiliency of farms to climate change and also to contribute to reducing carbon emissions. So I'm going to move on from the global trend of agricultural transformation and talk about a little bit about who's in this whole dialogue around the world. And it is a global dialogue that is shaping kind of agricultural transformation. At Nutrien, we work with all of these organizations that you see on the screen. And that's really one of the roles that I have in the company, is to interface with all of these different organizations and talk about production agriculture from a North American perspective, an Australian perspective, a South American perspective. The leading global organizations that are on the screen here, they see agricultural transformation as a really important pathway to deliver on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And these leading voices shape that dialogue around sustainable agriculture. So some of the logos you may not be familiar with, I'll just walk through them quickly. The WBCSD is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. WWF, the PANDA, everybody knows, World Wildlife Fund, but you may not know that they have an entire part of their organization that is dedicated to agriculture. We also work with the EAT organization, which is located out of Europe, and they're really focused on improving agriculture and more so on the food management side as well. So food waste, healthy diets. You may have heard them in regard to some of the work that they've done in understanding the relationship of diet to climate. And we also work with the World Economic Forum, the Growing Africa's Green Alliance Forum. So just a lot of different groups that come together, and that's an important component, is this multi-stakeholder component in agricultural transformation and how things get done around the world. So it's not really productive for any one group on its own to put forward, this is the right pathway. It really becomes productive when organizations like these work together with industry and universities, countries, to really form an opinion and a direction. So that's kind of how some of the dialogue is shaped, I would say, around agricultural transformation and who the leading voices are. I want to talk a little bit about the rising environmental concerns and just set the stage a little bit on the global perspective around rising environmental concerns. So what we're seeing is that there are increased concerns around deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change, land degradation. Those are some of the rising environmental concerns that are being really studied and acted upon. And when it comes to agriculture and has an effect on land use, and agriculture contributes about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be agriculture, forestry, and other land uses combined. That's a lot of sectors, but I think that it's important to say that agriculture, when we look at that 24% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, it includes ag, forestry, and other land uses. And so what I'm showing here is two kind of pieces of context. One of them, which talks to the urgency around climate change. So what we're seeing in surface air temperature anomalies for 2018 and comparing that to the 1981 to 2010 average. And you can see that there are areas of the world where we have increased temperatures in that kind of 2 to 3 degree range up in some of the more northern latitudes. And so just a real concern with documented evidence of climate change and increased temperatures globally that is causing some of the changes that we're seeing in our local kind of climate and weather. And so agriculture has been seen as one of the kind of dominant drivers of deforestation worldwide. And it's important to think about context when we talk about where is deforestation occurring worldwide. And I apologize if this image on the bottom left here is a little bit small, but what I wanted to show here was that deforestation occurs differently in different parts of the world. So we may have a global statement that is agriculture causes 80% of deforestation worldwide. But if we think about what does that look like in different parts of the world and in North America, I think that's important to understand. So if we look at Asia and Europe, they've had a net increase in forested areas. So we see Asia here and Europe here. They're showing a net increase in forested areas since 1990. If we look at North and Central America combined, then we see, that's this one right here, North and Central America combined, we see a slight decline in the last 10 years in terms of deforestation. So there's kind of a little bit of deforestation occurring now in North and Central America, but it's kind of at that zero level. And then if we look at South America and Africa, these are the areas where we're seeing the greatest amounts of deforestation. But if you look at South America, deforestation has been decreasing quite rapidly in the last 10 years. Whereas in Africa, we're still seeing a continuing increase in deforestation. So I just wanted to point out that when we hear global trends and comments, it's important that you dig deeper and think about what is the local context, especially if you're acting locally. And also, just, I guess, being aware of what shapes these global conversations. And for me personally, as I entered into this space, it's not helpful to be really defensive, is what I've learned. It's really helpful to understand each person's individual context and bring that into the discussion. So that's kind of the driver that we see around greenhouse gases, deforestation, and agriculture. And then I want to drill in a little bit and talk about, okay, let's talk about Canada's greenhouse gas emission profile and where is agriculture in that space. So first of all, in Canada, agriculture contributes about 8% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the full pie chart, this is a breakdown of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions from the IPCC report in 2017. And what we can see is agriculture is about 60 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Out of the total, we're about 8%. And if we look at changes in emissions, and I think this is really important, which sectors are changing their emissions? And you notice that I have a red box. There are some sectors that have been really active in reducing their emissions from 2005 to 2017. Some of the sectors that have been able to reduce their emissions really have been influenced by regulation that has caused a reduction in emissions. The one sector that we don't see a reduction in emissions is transportation. But what we expect is that we're going to see rapid reduction in emissions from transportation as the transportation sector adopts more electric energy. So that's probably going to leave agriculture, which is right here. And you can see that we haven't had a big decrease in emissions since 2005, but nor have we had a big increase in emissions. So while we have increased our productivity, we have not increased our emissions. However, I think that as we start looking further into the future, with transportation probably moving into a sector that is becoming a sector that is able to decrease its emissions, agriculture is really going to become the next focus area where we really need to look at how can we manage agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to dig a little bit more into what are the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, the gases are nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and methane primarily. And I have that up here in the top right-hand corner. So we can see that methane, approximately 40% of methane comes from enteric fermentation, so from livestock. About 13% comes from manure management, and approximately 42% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agricultural soils as nitrous oxide. So we want to dig into this a little bit more deeply in the next slides. But first, I wanted to maybe step back for a second and say, why is it important for us to look at the different types of gases? And that's because the different types of gases differ in their ability to trap heat. So that's why everything is expressed on a carbon dioxide equivalent basis. And this graph is shown on a carbon dioxide equivalent basis in terms of the impact, but I did see right here, carbon dioxide equivalent basis, but I did want to be able to show you what are the gases and on an equivalent basis, how much do they contribute? If we look at this 42% of agricultural emissions from soils being primarily nitrous oxide, this is where I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper, because this is the part where our company, Nutrien, is really paying attention and looking for opportunities to reduce emissions from nitrous oxide. If we have a look at what's our contribution, so it is important to understand what's the contribution. And if we look at fertilizer use, we can see that fertilizer use from 2005 has increased. And as a result of the increasing use of fertilizer since 2005, we've seen an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So a pretty steep increase, about a 60% increase in greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide specifically, from increased fertilizer use since 2005. But I quickly want to step back and remind you that we did not see a total increase in emissions from agriculture. Our productivity has increased, and just wanted to kind of say, although our emissions from nitrous oxide have increased, we've also increased our crop productivity, and we've been able to decrease emissions. So we're kind of staying in balance. So that's kind of just an interesting point there. But this is the area where we know that we're seeing increased emissions from increased fertilizer use, which has increased the amount of crop production. But this is an area where our company is very focused. How do we reduce that? So I am going to talk after this slide about how our company is looking at reducing emissions of nitrous oxide. But then just to dig into the nitrous oxide emissions a little bit deeper. So nitrous oxide emissions coming from agricultural soils. About 41% of the emissions from agricultural soils are a result of the use of fertilizer. But we also see emissions from agricultural soils of nitrous oxide from other sources. So organic nitrogen application contributes emissions of nitrous oxide. When we grow a crop, that crop residue that remains on the soil surface decomposes, and that can also contribute nitrous oxide emissions. We also have mineralization of soil organic carbon. So the naturally occurring organic carbon within soil mineralizes, releases nitrous oxide. And then we've got a little bit of a sink happening. So conservation tillage, which means fields that are farmed without tillage, that actually is a net sink for nitrous oxide emissions. We're seeing a reduction of nitrous oxide emissions here. We also have nitrous oxide emissions that count from manure that occurs on pastures, from irrigation use in summer fallow. So I wanted to just show the whole picture. Oh, and I missed this component. So agricultural soils can also be an indirect source of nitrous oxide emissions. So that occurs when we have nitrate, so a form of the nitrogen molecule that's mobile and can leach off of a field. So we might get nitrate movement in water that would occur. And so we're seeing nitrous oxide loss that doesn't occur on the field, but occurs as a result of that nitrate moving off the field into other areas. I'm just mindful of the time, so just gave myself a little time check there. And I think we want to leave some time for questions. So just distracted for a moment. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is Nutrien doing with farmers regarding greenhouse gas emissions, particularly nitrous oxide, from fertilizer use. You might have been aware that Nutrien recently launched and had a really big media day not too many weeks ago around our carbon program. And we're calling it a pilot program for 2 years. The reason we're calling it a pilot program, although we're implementing a program in the field, we feel that there's a lot of learning to do. So to talk a little bit about this carbon pilot program, really our objectives in the carbon pilot program as Nutrien is to understand how farmers can be engaged to increase the adoption of practices in their farming operations that reduces the amount of nitrous oxide emission. And in those practices that reduce nitrous oxide emission, particularly from fertilizer use, we are really looking at what is the cost of implementing those practices, how much carbon emission reduction can be achieved from those practices, and can we monetize a carbon credit that would help a farmer pay for the implementation of some of those practices to reduce emissions. So our primary objective in our carbon pilot is really to create a streamlined process that would pay farmers for emission reductions on their farms, and that would lead farmers to be able to more easily implement those practices. And the way that we're doing that is by following some already existing protocols which describe methods and the expected amount of emission reduction that can occur, and understanding how much documentation of the management practices and measurement needs to occur in order for farmers to participate in carbon markets. So as I said, we've implemented a 2-year pilot project. It's occurring in North America. So we have project locations in Canada as well as the US. And in Canada, we've got about 40 farmers that we're working with directly across Western Canada. And we've got about 40,000 acres, which is pretty significant for a pilot project, that we are measuring the implementation of practices and the associated emission reductions from those practices. And I'd like to put air quotes around the word measuring, because measuring probably leads you to think that we're in the field taking gas samples or some other measurement. And in fact, we used a modeled approach for estimating the emission reductions, and the models being based on our country's national inventory report methodologies for estimating greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So some pretty heavy technical detail and quantification there, but just trying to be as transparent as I can regarding the approach that we're taking for a modeled estimate of emission reduction. Some of the things that we have to employ to do this are digital tools to capture all of the data around the farm management practices. And so we have digital farming platforms, precision farming tools that are used today to measure the amount of inputs that farmers use, to record the type and yield of crop that they achieve, and to model all of that digitally and to be able to create maps of that so farmers can actually see the impact of the decisions that they're having laid out on a map on the field, so that they can see what's happening in the fields from the practices that they select. Coming out of that approach, we're identifying best management practices for farmers to adopt to increase the amount of emission reductions. And we're determining what a carbon value would be in terms of a payment to the grower based on the current carbon market price in a regulated market in Canada of $40 per metric ton. We're actually paying our farm participants ourselves to participate in this project with us, because at this piloting phase, we're not going to be transacting carbon credits on a market. We're really much more interested in learning how farmers can work with us to capture all the necessary data and information, and how we can use some of the more current digital tools like yield monitors on combines, and the accuracy of that information and how that meets the needs of a marketplace that is really looking for complete, robust transparency around that carbon emission reduction. So there's a lot of data and calculation and information and evidence that's required to prove that what we're doing has integrity and can be transacted as a tradable asset in a marketplace. And we're just not quite there yet. And working with governments to help them, I think, refine their approach a little bit as well. So I guess, just keeping an eye on the time here and wanting to leave some time for questions, I'll try to quickly get into the last few slides. I'd say, going back to this global trends, the biggest trend today is really this concept of sustainable agriculture. But what does that mean? There's a lot of groups that have developed definitions based on their own level of knowledge, their concerns that they're trying to address, and the experience that they have. So there is a lot of different definitions of sustainable agriculture. The one that I think we probably ascribe to closest at Nutrien is one that was developed by a group called Field to Market. And that really is what I've placed up on the slide here. You can all read it, but really overall says that how do we meet the needs of the present while improving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs by increasing crop productivity, improving the environment, improving human health outcomes, and also improving social and economic well-being of agricultural communities. And I'd like to just take a couple minutes and talk about what I think of as 3 important elements of a sustainable agriculture program. One of those is collective action through the full value chain. That means working with multi-stakeholder groups. A second element is establishing a science-based metric for sustainable agriculture. And the third one is making pledges and commitments. So I have a few slides to demonstrate these, and then I'm gonna stop talking and leave a few minutes for questions. Just a quick time check with the organizers. Am I at about the right pace if I take 2 or 3 more minutes?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay. So to talk about the multi-stakeholder groups and collaborative action, I wanted to give you a visual of what a multi-stakeholder group looks like. So just looking at all of the logos that are on this slide here today, this gives you a sense of who the members are of an organization that I just referenced called Field to Market. And the stakeholder groups that are represented are food retailers, environmental organizations, scientists from universities, policymakers from government, the crop commodity organizations. And if you're not familiar with that term, that would be like a National Corn Growers Association in the US or a Canola Growers Association in Canada. And agribusiness, and Nutrien would be a member of the agribusiness organization. But that power in a multi-stakeholder group approach means that as we're making decisions around definitions and metrics, we're making those decisions together. And having everybody at the table lets us bring our own points of view and debate and set some real principles, like having science as the foundation of the decisions that we make. So it's been really helpful that these organizations have developed and worked together in defining sustainable agriculture. And I wanted to also give some examples of the kinds of pledges that companies make. And the reason that I've shown these is companies are really giving a depth of thought and detail into the pledges that they're making around sustainable agriculture. But these are not companies that necessarily have experience in the field in terms of working or understanding farm management practices. You wouldn't necessarily go to General Mills and ask them, how should I be managing my farm? But they are really becoming deeply engaged in understanding farm management and contributing to kind of this development of what a metric for sustainable agriculture should be as they're putting out their own metrics. So they're really interested in looking at reducing greenhouse gas emission efforts and using a broad value chain approach, working with upstream partners. One of them would be Nutrien. At Kellogg's, they're a little bit more prescriptive. They want to see an optimization in the use of fertilizer inputs, an estimation of greenhouse gas emissions, optimized water use, improved soil health. And Walmart's also been a leader in this space, looking at all the suppliers that provide product to Walmart and ensuring that those suppliers have a plan for sustainable agriculture as well. I'll leave this as my last slide so that there's time for questions, but to give you, if you're interested more in this space, just a lot of the organizations that we've worked with that are directly involved in a sustainable agriculture conversation at all different levels. And I'm going to leave this slide up in case you want to take notes or ask questions, but I'm going to turn it back to the moderators for questions this time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Michelle. That was awesome. We have a couple questions here, so we'll try to get through these as quick as we can. And yeah, so let's start with, we see a lot of polarized conversations in other natural resources like oil and gas and forestry, but how common is that in agriculture?
That's a great question. And it's really common because, like I said, we all come from different experience, different points of concern, different knowledge levels. I'd say one of the biggest areas of discussion is between organic and conventionally grown crops. And that can be a very polarizing discussion if we let it be a polarizing discussion. The way that I approach that discussion is always from a science basis. And I would say right now, the hot topic for us is thinking about biodiversity within managed landscapes. So many times people think that biodiversity only can occur in natural landscapes, and they don't really think about farm landscapes or managed landscapes as having an opportunity for biodiversity. When we think about organic farming systems, then they really are talking about the impact, avoiding the impact from the use of synthetic products on biodiversity. And when we come together and have a science discussion and we talk about the importance of some of those products in terms of lessening the impact to biodiversity, ensuring that those products are helping us get the most out of the most productive acres so that the acres that can be left in forages and grass crops and are there for habitat biodiversity so that happens, that's a kind of a common shared point of view. It's about finding those common shared points of view and knowing who you're talking with. Some folks you're not going to be able to move the needle on, but I think if you can find what your common points of view are and allow for differences, that's how we've been able to work with groups that maybe have really opposing views to ours.
Michelle, kind of backing off of that question, what are some of the most misunderstood concepts in agriculture, specifically GMOs?
GMOs is a great question. So I'd say with GMOs, people are very focused on GMOs in crops, and they forget about the application of GMO technology in other sectors. So you may not know that most of the vitamins that you eat are produced using GMO technology that enables bacteria to produce those vitamins in a manufacturing setting. So I think that probably shocks people to learn that GMO technology is used to produce vitamins. It's just a technology type. And what I'm seeing as a trend is that as people are starting to understand the importance of using science, using other technologies, so we call it gene editing, like the CRISPR technology, to produce products that have lower environmental impacts and maybe better human health impacts. As we see more of those products come to the marketplace, what I'm seeing is that the level of debate and concern around GMOs is really dropping it's dropping down on the scale of concerns that people have as they become aware of how this technology provides a lot of values that is really going to help us solve a lot of the problems around improving the environment or improving human health.
That's awesome. I learned about GMOs this year in environmental science. We probably have time for about 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask, what are jobs for young professionals in ag that people don't think of beyond being a farmer? And is it a promising industry for careers?
Agriculture, I work in this industry. It's my favorite industry. Let me just give you a suite of careers that are occurring right now, people that I work with. So I work with a lot of digital data scientists because in agriculture, we've been really good at developing remote sensing technologies, methods of capturing data on the farm from monitors. And we need to apply all that data through scientific models to create knowledge and information. So we hire a lot of digital data science people. And if you have a background in biology, in agronomy, and digital data science, there's a huge opportunity right now in agriculture. Other people that I work with are seed breeders. So a lot of people I work with are science people when I think about what I do in agriculture.
But what you're saying is we don't have to run tractor all the time.
There's very few people in my company that drive a tractor.
Okay. Well,
chemical background, chemical engineering. I don't know. Yeah, it's just kind of escaping you. One fellow on my team is a water expert, so his background is hydrology. And we look at the impacts of agriculture on watersheds. So it's very broad.
So it's very much a hands-on kind of academic.
Yeah, there's a lot of science in academia, but because we have a large sustainability program, we also address human health, or not human health, but human dimensions of sustainability within our company, community dimensions. So we're impacting communities and in terms of employment, impacting them with our operations. So there's a lot of different jobs in agriculture.
Well, Michelle, I don't know if we have enough time to get to the rest of these questions, but thank you so much for coming in. It was wonderful to listen to you, and it's very nice to see what steps our agriculture sector is taking towards sustainability.